Immigration in the late 19th century. We're coming to America, everybody. So, before we talk about the new immigrants, we need to give some respect to the old immigrants. From 1850 to 1870, you have more than 2 million people coming to America because it's so awesome. And in the 1880s, that number more than doubles. So, up until this period of time, the people that were coming over were basically Western Europeans. Your Brits, your Irish, your French, your Germans. Their religion is generally Protestant Christians, except, of course, for those Irish Catholics and their red hair and their potatoes. They have really high literacy rates at this time, so very intelligent. And they are, of course, being from Western Europe, very accustomed to a representative form of government. So coming to America and our cultures and traditions are very much what they are used to as well. The new immigrants, however, are very different. So the flow of immigration changes in the 1890s, and so we no longer have Western Europeans flocking to America. Now, the majority of immigrants are from Southern and Eastern Europe. So this includes the Italians, the Slavs, the Greeks, the Poles, as well as the Russians. And the religions that they are practicing are Orthodox Christians, and then you also have a large influx of Jews as well. And these countries have very little tradition of representative democracy, so the government they find in America is very different from what they're used to. And another big difference between the new immigrants and the old immigrants is the literacy rates. These new immigrants are highly illiterate, and they're generally very, very poor. And because they're unskilled and illiterate and not very bright, they choose to work in factories. And so they move into the cities, mainly because they just don't have the means to go out west and settle on farms. And so they're leaving from famine, from cholera, and from lack of economic opportunity in their native homelands. They're also fleeing racial, religious, and political persecution, as well as mandatory military service in their countries. And so they're hoping that America can provide them with a new life. So these are some of the reasons why the new immigrants come. They're out of room in Europe. As you know, European countries are very small geographically, and so there just simply isn't enough room for the massive population growth that Europe is experiencing. The U.S. is considered to be the land of opportunity. You actually had a lot of American industries that sought cheap labor. They sent recruiters abroad to these countries. Railroads who were eager to sell land and build up the traffic on their lines would distribute propaganda in a host of languages trying to encourage immigrants to come to America. And as I stated, many of these countries were forcing their citizens to serve in the military. They were persecuting different religious groups, and they wanted to escape this persecution, so they came to the United States. So the journey to America was not really an easy one. They all came by boat, okay, and you can see the average length of journey there. So going across the Atlantic, so from Europe to the U.S., it was about a week, and from China to the Pacific, across the Pacific to California, it was about 3 weeks. Most immigrants were really poor, so they could only afford steerage tickets, which meant that they were under the ship below. They were rarely allowed on deck. They were huddled together. There were rats. It was cold. It was wet. There were lots of diseases. It smelled really bad. They had to share toilet facilities. And so many people got sick and didn't even make it across the journey because they died due to the really horrible conditions. But when they did make it, they went to Ellis Island, and Ellis Island is pictured above. Initially, immigrants stopped at Castle Garden, which was at the port of New York, but that was overflowing with corruption, and so the U.S. government ordered it shut down. And so Ellis Island opens up in 1886 off the New Jersey coast and 1,300 feet from the Statue of Liberty, which was, of course, a gift from the French government. And it soon comes to be a symbol of hope and promise for a new life in America for these immigrants. And inscribed at the bottom of the Statue of Liberty is poet Emma Lazarus' tribute to the promise of new life in America, in which she says, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door." And those were the first words many immigrants saw when they got off the boat at Ellis Island. But unfortunately, since they couldn't speak or read English, they had no idea what the message said. So at Ellis Island, they stopped at inspection stations. Most European immigrants went through Ellis Island, and then over in California, if you were coming from China, you would stop at Angel Island. And about 20% of the immigrants coming over could expect to be detained a day or two before being allowed to leave Ellis Island and become Americans. So to gain admittance to the country, immigrants had to first pass a physical examination by a doctor. It's important to know that Ellis Island was not a comforting place. Its purpose was to process immigrants, not to welcome them. So once they got off the boat, they were besieged by an army of inspectors and doctors and nurses and public officials who questioned them, examined them, and documented them. And all the while, the immigrant worried, will they let me in? And although some who were sick or lame were detained for days or even weeks, the vast majority of immigrants received stamps of approval and were on their way really in as little as 3 to 4 hours. And here's just some pictures of Ellis Island. You can kind of look at those. Dormitory, so if you were detained, this is kind of where you hung out for a while. And if you're so inclined, you can visit this website and see if any of your family members passed through Ellis Island. So once immigrants were processed through Ellis Island, they were free to begin their new life. But however, many of the immigrants did in fact resist assimilation into American culture. They very much wanted to retain their own. They tended to live in neighborhoods or ghettos with other people from their country. And so they sent their children to religious schools. They still read their home newspapers. They still spoke in their language. They still made their same food and celebrated their holidays for their country. But often what they found is that their children would grow up American and kind of abandon the old ways, kind of much to the chagrin of their families. So the government did very little to help the new immigrants assimilate. They didn't really feel that that was their job. It was their choice to come, and they were going to have to pretty much make their own way. So the task of assimilating immigrants pretty much fell to the political machines and the party bosses who controlled the cities. And so they would trade jobs and services for votes. So you would get off the boat and you would be met by a party boss who would offer the new immigrants a place to work and somewhere to live, so long as that immigrant promised their political loyalty and, of course, their vote to those individuals. And jobs, housing, food, all of this was provided. And you'll read about this quite a bit with regards to Boss Tweed. He was one of the party bosses in New York City, and he is featured in The Jungle. So, of course, there was nativist reaction to this large degree of immigrants coming to the United States. Nativists were basically a group that favored native-born Americans over immigrants. So some arguments never die, right? We still have the same today. And here are some of the reasons why the nativists disliked the new immigrants, other than the fact that they were just simply racist. Of course, the immigrants spoke unfamiliar languages, so you didn't know if they were talking about you or not. They weren't Protestant Christians, they were Orthodox Christians, or gosh forbid, they were Jewish. They had a really high birth rate, so the nativists worried that eventually the immigrant children would outnumber nativist children. And they worried about, of course, mixing the different races and, what would be the result of that. Oh, the horror. They worked for really low wages, and so nativists worried that their jobs would be taken. And they had a lot of different political ideas. They came from socialist and communist countries, and so many of them advocated for similar ideas here in the United States, which of course are very opposed to democracy and capitalism. Labor leaders eventually supported cutting off the flow of immigration because they wanted to protect American jobs. Because immigrants would usually work cheap, they often would not go on strike, and because they didn't speak English, it was hard to unionize them. And finally, Congress does start to get involved. In 1882, they pass a law that bans paupers, basically poor people, criminals, and convicts from immigrating. So if you were any of those when you were stopped in Ellis Island, you would probably be sent back. And then later laws passed by Congress would ban polygamists, people who had more than one wife, prostitutes, because we already had enough of those, alcoholics, again, way too many here, anarchists, because we kind of liked our government and wanted to keep it, and of course people with contagious diseases, because, that's just gross. And then in 1917, Congress passes a literacy test that was enacted after 3 presidents had gone ahead and vetoed it. So that's it for immigration. Hope you enjoyed it.